London, 1814. The crystal chandeliers of Devonshire House blazed with 1,000 candles, transforming the grand ballroom into a constellation of light and ambition. The season's most eligible debutantes swirled across the floor like exotic birds, their gowns a riot of jewel tones and imported silks, each girl a carefully constructed masterpiece designed to capture the attention of England's most discerning gentlemen. Yet near the marble pillars bordering the dance floor, Violetta Montgomery stood in deliberate shadow, a study in muted rose silk that seemed designed to deflect rather than attract notice. At 22, she had learned to occupy the spaces between not quite servant, not quite family, not quite guest. It was a skill honed over years of necessity, the art of being present but unnoticed, available but never presumptuous. Not that any observer would connect her to the vision currently holding court beneath the musicians' gallery. Georgiana Thorne, Violetta's stepsister, was all golden curls and calculated laughter. Her ice blue gown cut just daringly enough to suggest sophistication without crossing into scandal. She held court among no fewer than 5 besotted gentlemen, each vying for the privilege of claiming her next dance. Her mother had trained her well. "Your stepmother has staged quite the triumph tonight," came a dry voice at Violetta's elbow. She turned to find Mrs. Pemberton, her late mother's oldest friend, observing the spectacle with shrewd eyes that missed very little. "Georgiana is very accomplished," Violetta replied carefully, years of practice keeping her voice neutral. She had learned long ago that any criticism of her step-family found its way back to Lady Cordelia, usually with embellishments that made the punishment far exceed the crime. "Accomplished at spending your dowry, certainly." Mrs. Pemberton's fan snapped open with a sound like a judge's gavel. "That gown alone cost what your mother intended for your first season. The emeralds were your grandmother's." Violetta said nothing. What was there to say? The transformation of her inheritance into her stepsister's social triumph was a fait accompli, as inevitable as the changing seasons. Mrs. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "But perhaps it no longer matters. I've just come from speaking with your father's solicitor at the card room. The Montgomery accounts are empty, my dear. Your stepmother has been living on credit for months. The creditors are beginning to circle." The ballroom seemed to tilt. Violetta's fingers found the cold marble pillar beside her, grounding herself against the wave of vertigo. Empty. After everything sacrificed, every economy she'd practiced in silence, every humiliation she'd swallowed without complaint, it was all gone. Spent. Wasted on a glittering illusion that would evaporate the moment the creditors made their first demand. Across the room, Lady Cordelia Thorne Montgomery held court near the refreshment tables, her beauty undiminished at 40, her laughter pitched to carry across half the ballroom. She wore burgundy silk that had cost more than their household staff's quarterly wages, diamonds winking at her throat and wrists with each practiced gesture. Since marrying Violetta's father 3 years after his first wife's death, Cordelia had transformed their modest household into a stage for her own daughter's elevation. What she lacked in actual rank, she compensated for with ruthless social maneuvering and what remained of Violetta's inheritance. "Perhaps father doesn't know the extent of it," Violetta said, hearing the futility even as she spoke the words. "If I could speak with him," Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened with pity. That was somehow worse than her earlier sharpness. "Sweet child, what can you possibly do? You've already given everything. And your father—" She trailed off, but they both knew. Lord Montgomery had given Cordelia complete control of the household accounts within 6 months of their marriage. He preferred not to trouble himself with such matters. The orchestra's melody shifted then. the lilting waltz fading into expectant silence. The couples on the floor began to still, heads turning like flowers following the sun toward the ballroom entrance. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the rustle of silk seemed to hush. The crowd didn't merely part. It seemed to draw back like a tide retreating from shore, creating a channel of empty floor that gleamed under the chandelier's merciless light. His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood. The majordomo's voice rang out, and the ballroom fell into cathedral silence. Sebastian Crane, Duke of Blackwood, appeared in the doorway like a figure from a darker, more serious age. At 31, he carried his title with the same severe authority that had made the Blackwood name synonymous with power for 3 centuries. His tall frame was clad in stark black evening clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, emphasizing the harsh beauty of his features, the strong jaw, the aristocratic nose, the dark eyes that surveyed the assembled company with an expression somewhere between boredom and disdain. "Good heavens," Mrs. Pemberton breathed beside Violetta. "I haven't seen Blackwood at a season event in 4 years, not since his father died and he inherited." The effect of his presence was instantaneous and almost comical in its uniformity. Mothers straightened as if pulled by invisible strings. Daughters smoothed their gowns with trembling hands, arranged their features into expressions of graceful interest. Violetta watched her stepmother's entire bearing transform, her calculated charm sharpening into something predatory and focused. "Finally taking a bride. My mother heard it directly from Lady Ashworth," a voice whispered nearby. "Only considering the top-ranked families naturally. Someone like Lady Penelope Hartshire, or perhaps the Worthington girl. A duke of his consequence doesn't notice girls without proper connections." Violetta studied the duke as he moved through the crowd, acknowledging greetings with barely perceptible nods, but stopping for no one. There was something almost lonely in his remoteness, she thought, as though he erected battlements between himself and the grasping world around him. She recognized the isolation. She lived it herself, though from the opposite direction. He was too elevated to be reached. She was too insignificant to be noticed. "Oh no," Mrs. Pemberton murmured, her grip tightening on Violetta's arm. "Your stepmother is going to intercept him." Indeed, Lady Cordelia was already in motion, towing Georgiana by the wrist, her trajectory calculated with military precision to intersect the Duke's path. But her eyes, Violetta's stomach turned to ice. Her eyes kept flicking back toward Violetta herself with an expression of venomous purpose that she'd learned to recognize and fear. "I should," Violetta began, already knowing it was futile, already turning to retreat deeper into the shadows where she belonged, where she was safe. But Cordelia's voice carried with perfect, deliberate clarity across the sudden quiet. "Violetta, do come here, darling. You're lurking like a paid companion." Every head within 20 feet turned. Violetta froze, caught like a rabbit in an open field, the eyes of London society suddenly fixed upon her with curiosity, pity, and in some cases, barely disguised amusement. Her cheeks burned as she forced herself to move forward, each step requiring conscious effort, acutely aware of how plain her rose silk must appear next to Georgiana's shimmering blue, how severe her simple arrangement of dark hair compared to her stepsister's artful curls. Cordelia's smile was poisonous honey as Violetta reluctantly stopped beside her, precisely 3 feet from where the Duke of Blackwood stood, his expression unreadable as carved granite. "Your Grace," Cordelia purred, executing a curtsy that managed to be both deferential and subtly suggestive. "May I present my stepdaughter, Violetta, and my own daughter, Georgiana?" She paused, allowing her gaze to travel over Violetta with theatrical assessment before releasing a laugh designed to sound affectionate, but edged with a cruelty that landed like a physical blow. "Though I'm afraid Violetta isn't really his type, are you, dear?" Her hand gestured vaguely at Violetta, as though presenting evidence to a jury. "A Duke of Blackwood's standing requires, well, someone like my Georgiana. You understand?" The silence that followed was excruciating. Violetta felt the heat of humiliation crawl up her neck, spread across her face like a stain. She couldn't bring herself to raise her eyes from the floor. Couldn't bear to see the Duke's agreement in his expression. Or worse, his polite indifference. Around them, she sensed, rather than saw, the ripple of reaction, the barely suppressed gasps, the exchanged glances, the social catastrophe of being so publicly diminished. "On the contrary," came the Duke's voice, cold as winter steel and twice as sharp, cutting through the whispers like a blade. "I find authenticity infinitely more appealing than performance." Violetta's head snapped up. The Duke of Blackwood was looking directly at her, only at her, with an intensity that made the crowded ballroom disappear, made the hundreds of watching eyes cease to exist. His dark gaze held hers with something she couldn't quite name. Assessment, certainly, but also a flicker of what might have been recognition, as though he'd found something he'd been searching for without knowing it was lost. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his deep voice carrying across the silent ballroom with perfect clarity, extending his hand with deliberate precision that transformed the gesture into something almost ceremonial. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance? My beautiful family, if Violetta had the courage to stand up to her cruel stepmother, surely you can find the courage to hit that subscribe button. It takes 2 seconds and costs you nothing, but it means everything to me. Now, let's see what the Duke does next." The morning after the Devonshire ball, Violetta sat in the smallest parlor of Montgomery House, the one reserved for mending and other tasks deemed too menial for the main receiving rooms. Her fingers worked mechanically at the hem of one of Georgiana's gowns, though her mind was elsewhere, replaying the impossible events of the previous evening with the confused disbelief of someone who'd witnessed a miracle and couldn't quite trust their own senses. The Duke of Blackwood had danced with her. Not merely danced. He had claimed her hand with such deliberate authority that no one, not even Cordelia in all her calculating boldness, had dared to interfere. They had waltzed in complete silence, his hand firm at her waist, his expression unreadable as he'd guided her through the steps with effortless precision. She'd been too stunned to speak, too aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking their every movement, the whispers that had risen like a swarm of locusts the moment the music ended. He had returned her to Mrs. Pemberton with a bow, said nothing beyond, "Thank you, Miss Montgomery," and departed the ball within 15 minutes, leaving chaos in his wake. Cordelia had been apoplectic. The door to the parlor burst open without ceremony, and her stepmother swept in like an avenging angel, still in her morning wrapper, though it was nearly noon. "What did you say to him?" she demanded without preamble, her beauty sharpened into something cruel by rage. "What lies did you whisper while you were dancing?" "Nothing, ma'am." Violetta kept her eyes on her needlework, a strategy learned through years of weathering these storms. "We didn't speak at all." "Don't play innocent with me. A duke doesn't dance with a nobody without reason. You must have done something, said something to Lady Cordelia Montgomery?" The butler's voice from the doorway was uncertain. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, is here. He's asking to see Miss Violetta Montgomery." The color drained from Cordelia's face before flooding back in a furious crimson. "Here? Now?" She whirled toward the mirror above the mantelpiece, attempting to arrange her disheveled hair with frantic hands. "Tell him I'll be down momentarily. Violetta, get upstairs and change into something presentable. Georgiana needs to—" "Forgive me, my lady," the butler interrupted with obvious discomfort. "But His Grace was quite specific. He wishes to speak with Miss Violetta, alone. He's requested the use of Lord Montgomery's study." The silence that followed was dense enough to suffocate in. Cordelia's reflection in the mirror was a portrait of thwarted ambition and dawning fury. Alone? That's highly irregular. Completely inappropriate. I should be present as her stepmother, her chaperone. His Grace was most insistent, my lady. Violetta set down her mending with trembling hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. This made no sense. Dukes didn't call on unremarkable young women the morning after a single dance. They certainly didn't request private audiences in studies, the domain of business rather than courtship. "Go!" Cordelia hissed, gripping Violetta's arm hard enough to bruise. "And whatever he wants, whatever game he's playing, you will not embarrass this family. Do you understand me?" The study was her father's refuge, though he was conveniently absent this morning, no doubt sleeping off the previous night's excesses at his club. The Duke of Blackwood stood before the window, backlit by the pale London sun, his tall figure even more imposing in the modest room than it had been in the grand ballroom. He turned as she entered, and she sank into a curtsy more from instinct than conscious thought. "Miss Montgomery, please sit." He gestured to one of the leather chairs before the desk, waiting until she'd perched on its edge before taking the seat opposite rather than behind the desk, a choice that surprised her with its suggestion of equality. "Your Grace, I must apologize if I caused any offense last night. I assure you, I had no expectation. You caused no offense." His voice was clipped, businesslike, as though they were discussing a ledger rather than the social earthquake he'd triggered. "I asked you here because I have a proposition that requires directness. And I've learned that you possess a quality rare in London society. You appear capable of hearing truth without hysterics." Violetta blinked, uncertain how to respond to such a peculiar compliment. Thank you?" "It's not a compliment. It's an observation." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "I watched you last night, Miss Montgomery, before I asked you to dance. I watched your stepmother humiliate you publicly, and I watched you endure it with a dignity that spoke of long practice. You didn't weep, didn't flee, didn't manufacture a scene to garner sympathy. You simply endured." The accuracy of his assessment was mortifying. "I don't see what— I need a wife," he said flatly, and the words hung in the air like an anvil suspended by thread. "Not a bride, not a love match, not some romantic entanglement that will consume my time and attention. I need a wife in the purely functional sense. Someone to serve as mistress of my household, hostess for necessary social obligations, and most importantly, a barrier against the machinations of society's marriage-minded mothers and their calculating daughters." Violetta stared at him, wondering if she'd somehow fallen asleep over her mending and this was all some bizarre dream. "Your Grace, I'm not certain I understand." "I'm proposing marriage, Miss Montgomery. To you. Specifically to you." The room tilted. She gripped the arms of the chair, forcing air into her lungs. "But why? You don't know me. We've spoken perhaps 20 words total. Surely there are women of your own rank who would—" "Women of my rank want what I cannot give," he interrupted, his tone suggesting this was a speech he'd prepared, a logical argument he'd constructed with care. They want romance, attention, emotional investment. They want to be the Duchess of Blackwood in all the ways the title suggests: power, influence, position at the pinnacle of society. I have no interest in providing any of that. He stood, moving to the window, his back to her as he continued. What I require is someone intelligent enough to manage a large estate household, composed enough to handle social obligations without requiring my constant presence, and most crucially, someone who understands that this would be a practical arrangement rather than a romantic one. Someone who won't develop expectations I have no intention of meeting. I see. Violetta's voice sounded distant to her own ears. And what would I gain from this practical arrangement? He turned, and something almost like approval flickered across his severe features. Good. You asked the right questions. He returned to his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, suddenly intent. You would gain security, first and foremost. Freedom from your stepmother's household and whatever financial difficulties I suspect you're facing, based on certain inquiries I made this morning. You would have your own establishment, your own household to manage as you see fit. Access to one of the finest libraries in England, if you share my interest in books. And most importantly, Miss Montgomery, you would gain respect. The last word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her chest. Respect, she repeated softly. As the Duchess of Blackwood, no one would dare speak to you as your stepmother did last night. No one would dismiss you, overlook you, or treat you as though you were invisible. You would have position, authority, and the protection of one of the oldest names in England. He paused, his gaze unwavering. In exchange, I would require your competence, your discretion, and your companionship in the intellectual sense. Someone I can speak with about matters of substance without the tedious games of courtship. Violetta's mind raced, trying to find the trap, the cruelty hidden beneath this impossible offer. You're asking me to marry you for companionship? Convenience? Yes. Without affection? Affection may develop in the way it does between any two people who share a household and common interests, he said carefully. But I'm not offering you love, Miss Montgomery. I'm offering you partnership, mutual benefit, an escape from circumstances I suspect have become untenable. She should refuse. This was madness. Marrying a stranger for practical purposes, entering into a contract that promised everything except the one thing every young woman was taught to desire. And yet, how long do I have to consider your proposal? The question emerged before she'd consciously decided to ask it. For the first time, something almost like a smile touched his severe mouth. I'm leaving for Blackwood Manor in 3 days. If you accept, we would marry by special license before I depart, and you would accompany me. If you decline, I will not trouble you again, though I would ask for your discretion regarding this conversation. 3 days. 72 hours to decide whether to escape Cordelia's cruelty and her father's indifference, to trade the slow suffocation of her current existence for the unknown territory of a loveless but respectful marriage. I need to think, Violetta said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course. He rose, and she stood as well, her legs somehow supporting her despite feeling insubstantial as smoke. I'll call again tomorrow for your answer. And Miss Montgomery? Whatever you decide, I meant what I said last night. Authenticity is infinitely more valuable than performance. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He left her standing in her father's study, staring at the space he'd occupied, wondering if she'd just been offered salvation, or simply a more elegant form of imprisonment. The moment the Duke's carriage pulled away from Montgomery House, Cordelia descended like a fury from Greek tragedy. She'd been waiting in the hallway outside the study, her calculated composure stripped away to reveal the raw ambition beneath. What did he want? The demand came before Violetta had taken 3 steps from the study door. What did you discuss in there for nearly half an hour? Violetta considered lying, but exhaustion made her reckless. Or perhaps it was the first stirring of something that felt dangerously like hope. He proposed marriage. The words hung in the air for one crystalline moment before Cordelia's face contorted with such rage that Violetta instinctively stepped backward. Marriage? To you? Her laugh was shrill, edged with hysteria. That's impossible. You must have misunderstood. Men like the Duke of Blackwood don't propose to women like me? Violetta finished quietly. Yes, that was made quite clear last night. And yet, he did. You conniving little serpent? Cordelia's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. This was your plan all along, wasn't it? Playing the pathetic wallflower, the overlooked daughter, waiting for some misguided moment of charity. It wasn't charity. Violetta surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. And it wasn't a plan. But yes, he proposed. A marriage of practical convenience. Practical convenience, Cordelia repeated, her mind visibly racing behind her eyes. Then this isn't a love match. He's simply looking for someone manageable, someone who won't make demands. Her expression shifted, calculation replacing rage. You'll refuse, of course. I haven't decided. You haven't? Cordelia seized Violetta's arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. Listen to me very carefully. You will refuse this proposal. Graciously, with appropriate humility, citing your unworthiness for such an honor. Why? The question emerged with genuine curiosity. You've spent years telling me I'm unmarriageable, that no man of consequence would look at me. Now one has, and you want me to refuse? Cordelia's laugh was brittle. You stupid girl, don't you see? If you refuse, if you demonstrate the proper deference and humility, the Duke will be impressed by your modesty. He'll see Georgiana as the natural alternative, a young woman with the proper training, the proper beauty, the proper... You want me to refuse so you can offer him Georgiana instead. Understanding settled over Violetta like a weight. You think he'll simply transfer his proposal to your daughter, like ordering a different dish at dinner? It's the logical solution. Georgiana is everything you're not, accomplished, beautiful, bred for this exact position. Once he sees her properly, without the distraction of your bizarre little performance last night. It wasn't a performance. Violetta pulled her arm free, something hardening in her chest. And I don't think the Duke makes decisions lightly or changes them on a whim. He chose me deliberately, for specific reasons. Reasons? Cordelia's voice rose. What reasons could he possibly have? You have no fortune left, I've seen to that. No connections of value, no particular beauty or accomplishment. You're a placeholder, Violetta. A momentary aberration in judgment that he'll regret the moment he thinks clearly. Each word was designed to wound, and a year ago, even a month ago, they would have found their mark. Violetta had spent so long believing these exact things about herself that hearing them spoken aloud should have felt like confirmation rather than insult. But something had shifted during that strange interview in her father's study. The Duke had looked at her and seen something other than inadequacy. Perhaps, Violetta said softly, but it's his regret to have, not yours to prevent. Cordelia's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're actually considering accepting? Violetta, I'm trying to save you from humiliation. Can you imagine what will happen when you arrive at Blackwood Manor? When he sees you in full daylight, day after day, without the romantic glamour of a ballroom? He'll be appalled. You'll be sent away in disgrace, or worse, kept as a duchess in name only, hidden away while he seeks companionship elsewhere. He was quite clear about the nature of the arrangement. Violetta moved toward the stairs, suddenly desperate to escape this conversation, to find somewhere quiet to think. There's no romantic glamour involved. All the worse. Cordelia followed, her silk wrapper billowing behind her like battle flags. A marriage without affection is a prison, girl. At least here you have family, people who care for your welfare. Do I? Violetta stopped on the third step, turning to face her stepmother. Tell me, Cordelia, when was the last time anyone in this house cared for my welfare? When you spent my inheritance on Georgiana's wardrobe? When you sent away my mother's jewelry to pay for your own? When you introduced me last night as too plain for a duke's notice? I was protecting you from disappointment. You were ensuring your own daughter had no competition. The truth of it, spoken aloud for the first time, was liberating and terrifying in equal measure. You've spent 3 years making certain I understood my place, that I asked for nothing, expected nothing, wanted nothing. And now that something has been offered to me, something you wanted for Georgiana, you can't bear it. Cordelia's face flushed crimson. How dare you speak to me this way? After everything I've done for you, the home I've provided, the home you've provided? Violetta laughed, and the sound was foreign to her own ears. This was my mother's home, my home. You married into it, spent everything my mother left me, and convinced my father that your generosity in tolerating my presence was a kindness I should be grateful for. Your father will never permit this marriage. Cordelia's voice turned cold, calculating. I'll speak to him tonight. He'll forbid it. Father signed over all decisions regarding my future to you in the marriage settlement, Violetta said quietly. I found the documents last year when I was organizing his study. Legally, the choice is mine. The color drained from Cordelia's face. For a long moment, she simply stared at Violetta as though seeing her for the first time. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost pitying. You'll regret this. When you're alone in that enormous manor with a man who feels nothing for you, who chose you only because you're too timid to make demands, you'll remember this conversation. You'll remember that I tried to save you. Perhaps. Violetta turned and continued up the stairs. But at least the regret will be mine, not something imposed on me by someone else's ambition. She spent the rest of the day and all of the night that followed in her small room, weighing the impossible choice before her. The Duke's offer was cold, transactional, devoid of the romantic dreams she'd cherished as a girl. But those dreams had died slowly under Cordelia's regime, withered from neglect and the daily erosion of her self-worth. What he offered instead was something she'd stopped believing possible. Respect, security, purpose. A life where she might be valued for her competence rather than dismissed for her inadequacy. It wasn't love, but perhaps love was a luxury she could no longer afford to wait for. When the Duke called the following afternoon, Violetta met him in the same study, wearing her most practical day dress and her decision-like armor. I accept your proposal, Your Grace. He nodded as though he'd expected nothing less, though something that might have been relief flickered across his features. We'll marry by special license in 2 days. I've already made the arrangements. Is that acceptable? 2 days. Barely enough time to pack her meager belongings, to say goodbye to Mrs. Pemberton, to watch Cordelia's fury calcify into cold contempt. Yes. Good. He stood preparing to leave, then paused. Miss Montgomery, Violetta, I want you to understand something. This marriage may not be conventional, but I give you my word that you will be treated with the respect due to the Duchess of Blackwood. Always. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something that felt more solid, more reliable. A foundation built on honesty rather than sentiment. The wedding took place in a small chapel with only the legally required witnesses present. Violetta wore a simple cream gown, hastily altered from one of her mother's old dresses. Cordelia refused to attend, claiming a headache, though Violetta suspected she couldn't bear to witness her stepdaughter's elevation to a rank she'd coveted for Georgiana. Her father appeared, half drunk and bewildered, scrawling his signature on the register without meeting her eyes. He'd never been deliberately cruel, Violetta thought, as she watched him shuffle away afterward. He'd simply been absent, leaving space for Cordelia's cruelty to flourish unchecked. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian, she must learn to think of him as Sebastian now, though the intimacy of his given name felt strange on her tongue, bowed formally over her hand rather than attempting a kiss. It was exactly the sort of practical restraint she should have expected. Yet some small, stubborn part of her heart registered disappointment before she could suppress it. "Shall we, Your Grace?" he said, offering his arm, and the title struck her like a physical blow. She was a duchess now. The Duchess of Blackwood. The girl who'd been too plain, too poor, too insignificant to merit notice, was now one of the highest-ranked women in England. As their carriage pulled away from Montgomery House for the last time, Violetta caught a glimpse of Cordelia at the upstairs window. Her beautiful face twisted with such hatred that it should have frightened her. Instead, she felt only a profound sense of liberation. Like a bird finally released from a cage it had forgotten was locked. The journey to Blackwood Manor took the better part of 2 days, traveling north through countryside that grew progressively wilder and more dramatic as they left London's sprawl behind. Sebastian had chosen to ride alongside the carriage for much of the journey rather than sit inside with her. A choice Violetta told herself was practical. He was an excellent horseman and likely found the confinement of a carriage tedious while trying to ignore the small voice that whispered he was already regretting his decision. They stopped at coaching inns that cleared their finest rooms the moment the Duke's crest was recognized. Where Violetta was installed in separate quarters with a lady's maid Sebastian had thoughtfully engaged for the journey. The formality of it all, the separate rooms, the careful distance he maintained, the way he addressed her as Your Grace, with the same tone he might use for a business associate, should have reassured her that he meant to honor the practical nature of their arrangement. Instead, she found herself lying awake in unfamiliar beds, wondering what sort of life she'd chosen. On the afternoon of the second day, the carriage crested a hill, and Blackwood Manor revealed itself in the valley below. Violetta's breath caught. She'd known intellectually that Sebastian was a duke, that his estate would be grand, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of Blackwood Manor. The house rose from the landscape like something organic, as though it had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Gray stone walls stretched in elegant wings from a central structure that must have been Tudor in origin, with additions from succeeding centuries creating a harmonious whole that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. Formal gardens spread before it in geometric precision, while beyond, she could see the darker shapes of ancient forest pressing close. It was beautiful. It was also profoundly intimidating. Sebastian rode up beside the carriage, and she heard him call for the driver to stop. A moment later, he opened the door himself, offering his hand to help her down. "I thought you might want to see it properly before we arrive," he said, his tone carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. Pride, perhaps, or something more vulnerable, the desire for approval. "It's magnificent," Violetta said honestly, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "How old is the original structure?" "The central hall dates to 1523, built by the third Duke. Each generation has added something, though my grandfather had the good sense to hire Capability Brown for the gardens rather than attempt it himself." He stood beside her, surveying his inheritance with an expression that held affection tempered by what looked like burden. 300 rooms, give or take. 47 fireplaces, a staff of 68, though that fluctuates seasonally. The numbers were staggering. Violetta had grown up in what she'd considered a respectable house in London, but Montgomery House could have fit into one wing of Blackwood Manor with room to spare. "I see," she managed, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Sebastian turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You're frightened." It wasn't a question, and Violetta saw no point in lying. "I'm wondering if you've made a terrible mistake. I've never managed anything larger than a London townhouse, and even that was done under my stepmother's authority. This is..." She gestured helplessly at the manor. "I don't know if I'm capable of..." "You are." His certainty was absolute. "Mrs. Hendricks has been housekeeper here for 30 years. She knows every inch of this place and will teach you everything you need to know. I'm not expecting you to arrive fully formed as the Duchess of Blackwood, Violetta. I'm expecting you to learn, which requires intelligence and willingness, both of which you possess." The use of her given name, rare enough that each instance felt significant, steadied her. "And if I fail? Then we'll address the failure and find a solution. This is not a test you can pass or fail in a single moment." He offered his arm. "Come, let me introduce you to your new home properly." The approach to the manor was designed to impress. A tree-lined drive that offered tantalizing glimpses of the house before revealing it in full glory. As their carriage pulled to a stop before the main entrance, the massive doors opened, and what seemed like the entire household staff emerged in ordered ranks. Violetta's hand tightened on Sebastian's arm as he helped her down. She'd known there would be servants, of course, but seeing them assembled, footmen in livery, maids in crisp uniforms, senior staff in their distinctive dress, made the reality of her new position crash over her like a wave. "Your Grace, may I present Mrs. Hendricks, our housekeeper, and Mr. Bartholomew, the butler," Sebastian said. His tone formal but not cold, as an older woman in black bombazine and a distinguished gentleman with silver hair stepped forward. Mrs. Hendricks curtsied with the practiced grace of long service, her sharp eyes assessing Violetta with an intensity that should have felt judgmental, but somehow didn't. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor, Your Grace. We're honored to receive you." "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks." Violetta's voice sounded thin to her own ears, but it didn't shake. "I hope you'll be patient with me as I learn. I'm sure there's much about managing an estate of this size that I don't yet understand." Something shifted in the housekeeper's expression, approval, perhaps, or relief. "We'll be happy to assist in any way we can, Your Grace. His Grace has already informed us that you're to be given every support." Sebastian guided her along the line of servants, introducing senior staff by name and role, while the others bobbed curtsies or bowed. Violetta tried to memorize faces and names. The head cook, Mrs. Patterson, whose round face creased with a smile. The head gardener, Mr. Thorne, who had dirt under his nails and pride in his eyes. The stable master, the ladies' maids, the footmen. So many people, all looking to her with varying degrees of curiosity and hope. When they finally entered the house itself, Violetta had to suppress a gasp. The entrance hall rose 2 stories, with a grand staircase sweeping upward in a graceful curve. Portraits of previous dukes and duchesses looked down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge whether she was worthy to join their ranks. The floor was marble, black and white, in a checkerboard pattern, and the ceiling was coffered and gilded, catching the light from windows that must have been 12 feet tall. "Overwhelming?" Sebastian asked quietly, dismissing the hovering servants with a subtle gesture that left them blessedly alone. "Somewhat," Violetta admitted. "I keep expecting someone to realize there's been a mistake and ask me to leave." "There's been no mistake." He moved toward the staircase, clearly expecting her to follow. "Your rooms are in the family wing, connecting to mine through a shared sitting room. You'll have privacy when you want it. But we can take meals together or work in the same space when it's convenient. Mrs. Hendricks has assigned you a lady's maid, Susan, the girl you met outside. She's young but eager, and I'm told she has a talent for dressing hair." The practical arrangements, delivered in his characteristic businesslike tone, should have felt cold. Instead, Violetta found them reassuring. He wasn't expecting her to navigate this new world alone. He'd thought through the details, anticipated her needs. Her rooms, when he showed them to her, were larger than the entire 2nd floor of Montgomery House. The bedroom featured a 4-poster bed with midnight blue hangings, windows that overlooked the formal gardens, and furniture that looked both antique and exquisitely maintained. The adjacent dressing room was already being filled with her meager belongings, the few dresses she'd brought looking pathetically inadequate in the massive wardrobes. "I've arranged for a modiste to visit from York next week," Sebastian said, following her gaze. "You'll need a proper wardrobe befitting your position. Consider it a practical necessity rather than extravagance." The sitting room that connected her suite to his was perhaps the most revealing. Space. Clearly, it had been designed as neutral territory. Not quite his, not quite hers. A fireplace dominated one wall, with comfortable chairs arranged before it. But what caught Violetta's attention were the bookshelves lining 2 walls, already filled with volumes that made her fingers itch to explore them. "I took the liberty of having some books brought up from the library," Sebastian said. And for the first time since their wedding, he sounded almost uncertain. "I wasn't sure of your tastes, so I included a variety. Philosophy, poetry, novels, natural history. If there's something specific you'd prefer, this is perfect." Violetta moved closer to the shelves, reading titles with growing delight. "I haven't had access to books like these since my mother died. Cordelia thought novels were frivolous and philosophy inappropriate for women." "Then Cordelia was a fool." The blunt assessment surprised a laugh from her, and Sebastian's severe expression softened fractionally. "The library here is extensive, over 10,000 volumes. You're welcome to any of them, and if there's something we don't have, I maintain accounts with booksellers in London and Edinburgh." For the first time since accepting his proposal, Violetta felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest begin to loosen. This wasn't Montgomery House, where every book she read was questioned and her few intellectual interests dismissed as pretension. This was a place where her desire to learn was not just tolerated, but actively supported. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this. For thinking about what I might need. Not just the practical necessities, but..." She gestured at the books, struggling to articulate what they meant. "We agreed to be companions," Sebastian said. "Intellectual companions. That requires a meeting of minds, which requires cultivation." He moved toward the door that must lead to his own rooms, then paused. "Dinner is at 8. Dress is informal when we're dining alone, which will be most nights. I thought we might eat in the small dining room rather than the formal one. It seats only 12 rather than 40 and is considerably less oppressive. That sounds lovely. He nodded, already withdrawing. Mrs. Hendricks will come by at 6 to review the household schedule with you. Don't let her overwhelm you on the first day. You can learn gradually. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Violetta alone in her new rooms. She moved to the window, looking out over gardens that would take hours to explore, toward forests that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere in this enormous house, Sebastian was likely already in his study, attending to correspondence or estate business with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship. Not yet. But standing in these beautiful rooms, surrounded by books chosen for her pleasure, in a house where the servants treated her with genuine respect, rather than the grudging tolerance she'd endured at Montgomery House, Violetta felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. She'd been given a sanctuary. Whether it would become a home remained to be seen. But for now, sanctuary was enough. 3 weeks into her residence at Blackwood Manor, Violetta discovered the library in a state of magnificent chaos. She'd been exploring the East Wing, learning the geography of her new home with the systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. When she opened a set of double doors and found herself facing what could only be described as a bibliophile's dream and a cataloger's nightmare. The room stretched impossibly long, 2 stories high, with a gallery running around the upper level accessed by a graceful spiral staircase. Every wall was shelved floor to ceiling, and every shelf was crammed with books in no discernible order. Violetta stood in the doorway, torn between delight at the sheer volume of literature before her, and distress at the evident disorganization. Leather-bound folios sat next to cheap pamphlets. What appeared to be a pristine first edition of Paradise Lost was wedged between a farming manual and a collection of sermons. Ancient Greek texts mingled with contemporary novels in a democracy of chaos that suggested generations of Blackwood dukes had simply added their acquisitions wherever space permitted. "My grandfather's doing, mostly," came Sebastian's voice from behind her, and she turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, watching her with an expression that might have been amusement. He was a voracious collector, but had no interest in organization. "My father intended to catalog it all, but died before he could begin. I've been meaning to address it for years, but estate business always takes precedence." "It's magnificent," Violetta said, meaning it despite the disorder. "I've never seen so many books in one place. The Montgomery Library could fit in this room 4 times over. 10,347 volumes, according to the last approximate count." Sebastian moved into the room, his hand trailing along a shelf with casual familiarity. "Though that was a decade ago, and I've added at least 500 since. Probably more." An idea was forming in Violetta's mind. Tentative but growing stronger with each moment she spent surveying the magnificent disorder. "Sebastian," she said, and the use of his given name, which he'd requested she use when they were private, though she still found it strange on her tongue, made him look at her with sudden attention. "What if I cataloged it? Properly, I mean. Created a comprehensive system so you could actually find what you're looking for." His expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more complicated. That would be an enormous undertaking. Months of work, possibly a year or more, depending on how thoroughly you wanted to do it. "I have time," Violetta said quietly, "and I'd like to be useful. Mrs. Hendricks has the household running so smoothly that I feel rather superfluous. She's very kind about letting me learn, but I suspect I'm more hindrance than help at the moment." "You're not superfluous." Sebastian's tone was firm. You're the Duchess of Blackwood. Your presence alone serves a purpose. A symbolic purpose, perhaps. But I'd like to do something substantive. She moved deeper into the library, pulling a volume at random, a treatise on agricultural improvements she discovered, dated 1782. I could create a proper catalog, organize by subject and author, note the condition of valuable editions, identify any that need repair or rebinding. My mother taught me proper bibliographic practices. She was quite passionate about it. Sebastian was silent for a long moment, studying her with that penetrating gaze that always made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen. If you want to undertake this, I won't stop you. But Violetta, you don't need to prove your worth through labor. That's not why I married you. I know. And she did, intellectually. But years of Cordelia's conditioning, the constant message that her value lay only in what she could provide, what use she could serve, weren't so easily dismissed. But I want to do this. For myself as much as for you. Then I'm grateful, he said simply. And if you need anything, additional furniture, better lighting, a clerk to assist with the physical work of moving volumes, you need only ask. She began the next morning, armed with notebooks, pencils, and a methodology she'd devised overnight. The task was indeed enormous, but Violetta found herself energized rather than daunted. Each book was a small discovery, a glimpse into the interests and obsessions of previous Blackwood generations. She found agricultural manuals next to philosophical treatises, proof that some ancestor had been equally interested in crop rotation and Aristotle. A collection of scandalous French novels was hidden behind respectable histories, suggesting that the family had not always been as austere as Sebastian's current reputation suggested. She worked systematically, starting with the lower shelves in the northwest corner, removing each volume, recording its essential information, assessing its condition, and then temporarily shelving it in the rough subject categories she'd established. The work was physical enough to be tiring, but intellectual enough to be engaging, and the hours passed in a focused absorption she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. Sebastian began appearing in the library in the late afternoons, initially on the pretext of retrieving a specific volume, but gradually staying longer, settling into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace with his correspondence or estate ledgers. They worked in comfortable silence, the scratch of Violetta's pencil and the rustle of turning pages, the only sounds beyond the occasional pop from the fire. It was nearly a week into the project when Sebastian finally broke one of these silences with something other than a practical question. "What's that you're reading?" he asked. And Violetta looked up from the volume she'd been so absorbed in that she'd forgotten to record it in her catalog. "Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding," she said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks at being caught abandoning her organizational task for pure reading. "I'm sorry, I should be working. But I found it misshelved and started reading the preface, and then—" "Don't apologize for reading Hume," Sebastian interrupted, setting aside his own work. "What do you make of his arguments?" It was the first time he'd asked her opinion on anything beyond household management or her comfort at the manor. Violetta hesitated, old habits of self-censorship rising automatically. Cordelia had made it clear that men found intellectual women tedious, that expressing opinions on serious subjects was unbecoming. But Sebastian was watching her with genuine interest. His posture shifted from the formal distance he usually maintained to something more engaged. "I find his skepticism about causation fascinating, but not entirely convincing," Violetta said carefully. "The idea that we can't truly know that one event causes another, that we only observe constant conjunction and infer causation, it's intellectually rigorous, but practically unworkable. Because it would paralyze all action," Sebastian said, a note of approval in his voice. If we can't trust our observations to reveal genuine causal relationships, we have no basis for making decisions. Exactly. Violetta felt herself warming to the subject, the diffidence falling away. Though I think his point about the limits of empirical knowledge is valuable. We do tend to mistake correlation for causation, to see patterns where none exist because our minds crave order. Sebastian rose from his chair, moving to the shelves with the focused energy of someone pursuing an idea. Have you read his dialogues concerning natural religion? He extends the skepticism to arguments for divine existence in ways that are either brilliant or heretical, depending on one's perspective. He scanned the spines, frowning. It should be here, but in this chaos. Third shelf from the top, approximately 15 feet to your left, Violetta said. I cataloged that section yesterday. It's between Berkeley's 3 dialogues and a collection of sermons by someone named Tillotson. He looked at her with surprise that shifted into something warmer. You remember the location of every book you've cataloged? Not every book, Violetta admitted. But the notable ones, yes. My mother said I had a peculiar memory for that sort of thing. Sebastian retrieved the volume, but instead of returning to his chair, he settled on the floor beside where Violetta sat, surrounded by stacks of books and scattered notes. The informality of it, the Duke of Blackwood sitting on the floor of his own library, was so unexpected that she nearly laughed. Read me your favorite passage from the Hume, he said, gesturing to the volume still in her hands. I want to see what caught your attention. So she did, reading aloud the section on the limits of reason while Sebastian followed along in the dialogues, occasionally interrupting to point out connections or contradictions. The conversation sprawled from philosophy to theology to natural science, touching on books they'd both read and others they discovered in each other's knowledge like gifts. Violetta couldn't remember the last time she'd been allowed to speak freely about ideas, to follow the thread of an argument wherever it led without being told she was being tedious or unbecoming. Sebastian not only tolerated her intellectual interests, he matched them, challenged them, expanded them with references and questions that pushed her thinking in new directions. You studied at Cambridge, Violetta said when they'd been talking for nearly 2 hours, the light from the windows fading to dusk. My father mentioned it once. Which college? Trinity. Read classics and philosophy, though my father thought it impractical. Sebastian's expression suggested complicated memories. He believed a duke's education should be purely pragmatic, estate management, law, enough history to understand lineage. He considered my interest in philosophy self-indulgent. But you pursued it anyway. I was 17 and convinced I knew better than everyone. He smiled, and the expression transformed his usually severe features into something younger, more approachable. I was probably insufferable. My tutors certainly thought so. I would have liked to study at university, Violetta said quietly. My mother used to say it was a shame that women weren't admitted. She thought I had the temperament for scholarship. She was right. Sebastian's tone was matter-of-fact rather than flattering. Your approach to this catalog is as rigorous as any academic work I've seen. And your reading comprehension is better than half the men I studied with. The compliment settled over her like warmth, all the more meaningful for being unexpected. At Montgomery House, her intelligence had been something to hide, a liability that made her unmarriageable. Here, in this chaotic library, with this austere man who'd married her for purely practical reasons, it was valued. Thank you, she said, for this, for letting me do this work, for talking with me about it. I didn't realize how much I'd missed having conversations about ideas. Neither did I, Sebastian admitted. He stood, offering his hand to help her up from the floor where they'd been sitting, surrounded by philosophical treatises and forgotten about dinner entirely. "We should eat. Mrs. Patterson will have our food warming for the third time, and she'll give me that look she's perfected that makes me feel like a scolded child." Violetta laughed, accepting his hand, and felt the warmth of his grip linger even after he'd released her. They walked to the small dining room together, still discussing Hume's skepticism and whether empirical observation could ever constitute certain knowledge, their voices animated in a way they never were when discussing household matters or estate business. It wasn't love, but it was connection, genuine and unexpected, built on mutual respect and shared passion for ideas. And as Violetta took her seat at the dinner table, watching Sebastian's severe face become animated as he argued a point about causation, she thought that perhaps this practical marriage might offer something neither of them had anticipated: companionship in the truest sense of the word. The morning dawned clear and unseasonably warm for early October, and Sebastian surprised Violetta at breakfast with an unexpected proposal. "I thought we might ride out to the North Woods today," he said, his tone carefully casual in a way that suggested the invitation mattered more than he wanted to admit. "There's something I'd like to show you. If you ride, that is." I realized I never asked. "I do, though not well," Violetta admitted. "My mother taught me when I was young. But after she died, Cordelia sold my mare. She said maintaining a horse for my use was an unnecessary expense." Something dark flickered across Sebastian's face. "We have 23 horses in the stable. Choose whichever suits you best and consider her yours. I'll let Hendricks know you're to have access whenever you wish." An hour later, Violetta found herself mounted on a gentle gray mare named Artemis, following Sebastian through the formal gardens toward the wilder lands beyond. He sat his black gelding with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding since childhood. But he kept the pace moderate, frequently glancing back to ensure she was comfortable. They rode in companionable silence through cultivated parkland that gradually gave way to denser forest. The path narrowed, winding between ancient oaks whose branches formed a canopy overhead, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns. Violetta caught glimpses of the estate's tenant farms in the distance, neat cottages with smoke rising from chimneys, fields harvested and prepared for winter. "The woods have been part of the estate since the original land grant," Sebastian said as they rode deeper into the forest. "Some of these oaks are over 400 years old, my—" He paused, then continued with visible effort. "My mother used to say they'd witnessed every Blackwood triumph and tragedy, and if we were quiet enough, we might hear them whisper secrets." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother. In the 6 weeks since their marriage, Sebastian had spoken freely about estate management, shared his thoughts on philosophy and politics, but offered almost nothing about his family beyond the bare facts. His father had died when he was 27. He had no siblings. His mother had passed when he was young. Each detail had been delivered in the same flat tone he used for discussing crop yields, as though emotion could be excluded through sheer force of will. "She sounds like she had a poetic soul," Violetta said carefully. "She did. My father considered it a character flaw." Sebastian's jaw tightened. He believed sentiment was weakness, especially in someone of our rank. Duty was everything. Feeling was indulgent. They rode in silence for another quarter hour before the forest opened into a small clearing centered around a stone structure that took Violetta a moment to identify. It was a folly, she realized, but not the whimsical kind built for garden parties. This one was older, simpler, a small circular temple with Doric columns supporting a domed roof, built from the same gray stone as the manor, but weathered by centuries. My great-great-grandfather built it, Sebastian said, dismounting and moving to help Violetta down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. He was apparently given to romantic gestures. Family legend says he proposed to his wife here. The interior was cool and dim, light filtering through gaps in the stone where mortar had crumbled. Someone, Sebastian, Violetta suspected, had placed a simple wooden bench inside, positioned to look out through the columns toward a vista of forest, and in the distance, the gray shape of Blackwood Manor. I used to come here as a child, Sebastian said quietly, settling onto the bench and gesturing for her to join him. Whenever the house became unbearable, whenever my father's expectations felt like they were crushing me, I'd slip away and hide here for hours. The staff knew where to find me, but they were kind enough to pretend they didn't. Violetta sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited. She'd learned in their weeks together that Sebastian needed space to approach vulnerability, that pushing would only make him retreat behind his formidable reserve. I was 12 when I first understood what my father really wanted from me, he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant manor. Not a son, not even an heir, really. He wanted a perfectly crafted instrument of duty, a duke in training who would absorb his lessons about propriety and rank and emotional restraint until there was nothing left of Sebastian, only the Duke of Blackwood. His hands were clasped between his knees, knuckles white with tension. There was a girl that summer, Margaret, the vicar's daughter. We were friends, nothing more. We were children. But we'd spend hours exploring the estate, imagining adventures. She made me laugh. I'd forgotten I even could. Violetta felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What happened? My father found out. Not that anything inappropriate had occurred. There was nothing to find out, truly. But he considered even the friendship unsuitable. A future duke couldn't have close friendships with people of inferior rank. It suggested a lack of discrimination, a dangerous egalitarianism that would undermine my authority. Sebastian's voice was carefully controlled, but Violetta heard the old pain beneath it. He had the vicar transferred to a parish in Cornwall. Margaret and her family were gone within a fortnight. Sebastian, he told me it was a necessary lesson. That as the Duke of Blackwood, I would always be separate, elevated, that any attempt at genuine connection with those beneath my rank was not only inappropriate but cruel, because the inequality of power made true friendship impossible. Sebastian finally looked at her, and his dark eyes held a desolation that made her chest ache. He said that if I cared about Margaret at all, I would understand that my friendship only endangered her family's security. That the kindest thing I could do for anyone I cared about was maintain proper distance. He was wrong, Violetta said firmly. That wasn't kindness. That was control disguised as protection. Was it? Sebastian's smile was bitter. I'm not certain anymore. Look at what I've done to you, Violetta. Married you for practical purposes, trapped you in a contract designed to protect my own emotional isolation. How is that different from what my father taught me? It's different because you were honest about it, Violetta said. You didn't pretend affection you didn't feel. You offered me a choice, clearly stated. And you've treated me with more respect and consideration than anyone has in years. Respect. Sebastian laughed without humor. What a cold currency to base a marriage on. Perhaps. But it's more than I had before, more than I expected to find. She hesitated, then continued. And I think you're wrong about what your father taught you. He said genuine connection was impossible across differences in rank. But Sebastian, we've spent the last month talking about philosophy and literature, arguing about Hume and Locke, discussing everything from agricultural reform to the ethics of inherited privilege. If that's not genuine connection, what is? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the distant manor. I didn't expect that, he admitted quietly. When I proposed this arrangement, I thought I wanted an intellectual companion in the abstract sense. Someone I could talk to without the tedious games of courtship, yes, but still maintaining proper distance. I didn't anticipate. He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Didn't anticipate what? That I would enjoy your company as much as I do. The confession seemed pulled from him with effort. That I would find myself looking forward to our evenings in the library. That your observations would make me reconsider positions I've held for years. That sitting in silence with you while we both read would feel more companionable than conversations I've had with people I've known for decades. Violetta's breath caught. It wasn't a declaration of love, but coming from Sebastian, who rationed emotional admission as though it were precious currency, it was something more valuable. Honesty. Trust. I enjoy your company too, she said softly. More than I know how to express. You make me feel as though my thoughts matter, as though I'm not simply tolerated, but valued. Sebastian turned to face her fully, his expression intense. You are valued, not because of what you provide or what use you serve, but because of who you are. Your intelligence, your quiet strength, the way you observe everything and miss nothing. He paused, then added with visible effort, I want you to know that this marriage, whatever it was supposed to be, whatever practical arrangement I convinced myself I was making, it's become more than that. At least for me. For me as well, Violetta admitted. And saying it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. They sat in the ancient folly, the silence between them charged with something neither quite dared to name. Finally, Sebastian stood, offering his hand to help her up. But instead of releasing her immediately as he usually did, he held on, his thumb tracing a small circle against her palm. Thank you, he said, for listening, for not judging what I've told you about my father, about who I've tried not to become. You're nothing like what you've described, Violetta said. Your father wanted to create an instrument of duty. But Sebastian, you're so much more than that. You're thoughtful and principled and kind, even when you're trying to pretend you're only being practical. His laugh was startled, genuine. You make me sound far better than I am. I make you sound exactly as you are. You just haven't let many people see it. They rode back to the manor slowly, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, the upcoming harvest festival, a book of poetry Violetta had discovered in the library, Sebastian's plans for improvements to the tenant cottages. But something had shifted between them in that ancient folly. Some barrier had crumbled that neither of them had quite acknowledged was there. That evening, when they settled into their usual spots in the library, Violetta at the table with her cataloging work, Sebastian in his chair with estate correspondence, the comfortable silence felt different. Charged with possibility, weighted with the knowledge that the practical arrangement they'd agreed to was transforming into something neither had planned for, and both were beginning to want. If you're feeling even a fraction of the emotion I felt writing Sebastian's confession, then please, don't just feel it and leave. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're worthy of genuine love. Because here's the truth. These stories take days to research, write, and produce. And when you watch without engaging, the algorithm buries them. That means fewer people discover that they deserve a love like Sebastian and Violetta's. Don't let this story die in the algorithm. Like, share, subscribe. Then let's finish this journey together. The transformation happened gradually, in moments so small that Sebastian couldn't later identify when observation became admiration. And admiration became something more dangerous. He noticed it first during the Harvest Festival, watching from a distance as Violetta moved among the tenant families with an ease that seemed innate rather than practiced. She crouched in the dirt to admire a farmer's daughter's rag doll, her expensive day dress forgotten. She listened with genuine attention as old Mrs. Crawford explained her rheumatism remedies, asking questions that demonstrated she was actually absorbing the information rather than merely feigning polite interest. "Her Grace has a way with people," Mrs. Hendricks observed, appearing at Sebastian's elbow with her characteristic silent efficiency. The staff were uncertain at first. "We've had no mistress here since your mother, and that was 20 years past. But she's won them over completely." Sebastian watched Violetta laugh at something the blacksmith's wife said, her face transformed by genuine pleasure into something luminous. "How has she managed that?" "She sees them, Your Grace." Mrs. Hendricks's tone suggested this should be obvious. "Asks their names, remembers their families, notices when someone's unwell or troubled. Yesterday she spent an hour in the kitchen learning Mrs. Patterson's recipe for apple tart because she said it reminded her of something her mother used to make. The staff are half in love with her." They weren't the only ones, Sebastian realized with a jolt that was half recognition, half panic. He began noticing things he'd missed before, details his carefully maintained distance had obscured. The way Violetta always remembered which footman preferred which assignment and arranged the household schedule accordingly. How she'd quietly arranged for the scullery maid's ill mother to be seen by the estate physician, paying from her own allowance rather than the household accounts. The bookmark she'd made for him, a strip of leather embossed with a quote from Montaigne that she'd left without comment in the book he was currently reading. 1,000 small kindnesses, performed without expectation of recognition or reward. "You're staring," Violetta said one evening in the library, not looking up from her cataloging work. 2 months of systematic effort had transformed the chaotic collection into ordered sections, though she insisted she was barely halfway finished. "I was thinking," Sebastian said, which was true if incomplete. About how the lamplight caught in her dark hair. About how her habit of chewing her lower lip when concentrating had become endearing rather than merely observable. About how the library felt empty on the rare evenings when she retired early, how he'd started manufacturing excuses to bring her questions or observations just to extend their time together. "Estate business," he lied, and she looked up with an expression of amused skepticism that suggested she knew exactly what he was doing. "Of course. Very serious estate business that requires staring at me for 5 minutes. 3 minutes at most." I counted. She set down her pencil, stretching in a way that drew his attention to the graceful line of her neck, the curve of her shoulder. "Would you like to hear what I found today? It's rather extraordinary." She discovered a collection of letters tucked inside a first edition of Gulliver's Travels, correspondence between the third Duke and Jonathan Swift himself. Sebastian listened to her read them aloud, her voice animated with excitement, and felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. This wasn't the practical companionship he'd convinced himself he was arranging. This was desire, complicated and terrifying and completely inappropriate given the terms of their agreement. The crisis came on a Tuesday, mundane in its beginning. Violetta had ridden out to visit Mrs. Crawford, whose rheumatism had worsened with the cold weather. She'd been gone most of the afternoon, and Sebastian found himself checking the windows with increasing frequency. anxiety building without rational cause. When she finally returned, her dress was muddy and her hair had escaped its pins, and she was shaking. "What happened?" Sebastian demanded, meeting her in the entrance hall with more urgency than he'd intended. "Nothing serious," but her voice trembled. "Artemis shied at a rabbit on the path back. I wasn't prepared, and I fell. I'm fine, truly. Just shaken." She wasn't fine. There was a scrape on her hand, and her breathing was unsteady, and Sebastian felt rage and fear war in his chest in equal measure. "You could have been seriously injured. You should have taken a groom." "I didn't think I needed. That path is treacherous this time of year. If you'd hit your head, if Artemis had bolted..." He stopped himself, hearing his voice rise with an emotion he had no right to feel, no framework to express. Violetta looked up at him, and something in her expression made the words die in his throat. "Sebastian," she said softly, "I'm all right." Without thinking, without the careful control he'd maintained for 2 months, Sebastian pulled her against him. She fit perfectly, her head tucking under his chin, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid but steadying, could smell the scent of her hair, lavender, and something uniquely her. "I'm all right," she repeated, but she didn't pull away. They stood like that in the entrance hall, where any servant might see, propriety abandoned, and Sebastian felt the last of his carefully constructed distance crumble. This woman, who'd come to him as a practical solution, had become essential in ways he couldn't rationalize or defend. "Violetta," he said into her hair, and her name was confession and surrender. She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and what he saw in her eyes made his breath catch. Not just acceptance, but answer. The same want, the same terrified recognition. "We should talk," she whispered, "about what this has become." "Yes." But neither of them moved, caught in the charged space between acknowledgement and action. It was Violetta who bridged it, rising on her toes to press her lips to his with a tentative courage that unmade him. The kiss was soft, questioning, and Sebastian answered with a hunger that should have frightened him, but only felt like coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers. "This wasn't what I planned." "No." Her laugh was shaky. "You were very clear about the practical nature of our arrangement. I was a fool." He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. "I thought I could maintain distance. That respect and intellectual companionship would be enough. But Violetta, you've..." He struggled for words adequate to the feeling. "You've made it impossible to maintain that distance." "Good," she said simply, "because I stopped wanting distance weeks ago." They moved to the library by unspoken agreement, drawn to their sanctuary. But tonight they sat together on the settee rather than in their separate chairs. Sebastian kept her hand in his, unable to bear breaking contact, while she leaned against his shoulder with a trust that felt more intimate than any kiss. "I'm frightened," Violetta admitted quietly. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You married me because you didn't want emotional entanglement." "I know." Sebastian pressed his lips to her hair. "And you accepted because you needed security, not romance. I've broken our agreement. We both have." She tilted her head to look at him. "The question is, what we do now." Sebastian thought of his father's lessons about distance and duty, about the dangers of genuine connection. Then he thought of the last 2 months. The conversations that had challenged and delighted him, the quiet companionship that had become the center of his days. The woman who saw him not as a duke to be maneuvered, but as a man to be known. "We acknowledge it," he said finally. "This feeling between us. We stop pretending it's merely intellectual companionship or practical arrangement. We allow it to be what it's becoming." "And what is it becoming?" "I don't know yet." The honesty felt essential. "I've spent so long avoiding this kind of connection that I don't have language for it. But Violetta, when I thought you might be hurt today, when I saw you shaking..." He pulled her closer. "I can't pretend anymore that you're simply my Duchess in name. You've become infinitely more." She was quiet for a long moment, and he felt the tension in her body, the careful way she was choosing words. "At Montgomery House, I convinced myself I'd never be wanted for myself. That the best I could hope for was to be useful, to serve some purpose that made my presence tolerable." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm frightened that I've misread this, that what you're feeling is gratitude or affection, or anything except want." Sebastian turned her face toward his, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. "Desire. The bone-deep need to be near you that has nothing to do with household management or intellectual compatibility. Yes, I value your mind and your competence and your kindness. But I also want you, Violetta. In every way, a husband wants a wife." Her sharp intake of breath was answer enough. But she gave him words anyway. "I want that too. Want you. I've been trying so hard not to hope for it." This kiss was different from the first, deeper, more certain, weighted with mutual acknowledgement and permission. Sebastian felt her hands move to his hair, felt her body shift closer, and he tightened his arms around her with a possessiveness that should have alarmed him, but only felt right. When they finally drew apart, flushed and breathing hard, practical considerations reasserted themselves. "We should probably discuss the sleeping arrangements," Sebastian said, and felt Violetta's surprised laugh against his shoulder. "So romantic." "I'm trying to be honorable. But Violetta, I can't." He stopped, struggling with vulnerability. "I don't want separate rooms anymore. I don't want careful distance and polite formality. I want a real marriage with all the intimacy that entails." "Then stop being honorable," she said, looking up at him with eyes gone dark with want that mirrored his own. "Stop giving me space to change my mind." "I won't." The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in late November, delivered with the regular post, but carrying the unmistakable scent of malice. Sebastian found Violetta in the library, surrounded by her cataloging work as usual. But her face had gone pale as she stared at the cream-colored paper in her trembling hands. "What is it?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking the letter from her nerveless fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the content was devastatingly clear. "Your Grace," it began, with a formality that barely concealed contempt. "I write as a friend to inform you of rumors circulating in London regarding your recent marriage. Lady Cordelia Thorne has been quite vocal in certain circles, suggesting that the union was achieved through deception, that her stepdaughter employed manipulative tactics to ensnare a duke far above her station. She claims you are seeking an annulment on grounds of fraud and that the marriage was never consummated, being merely a legal arrangement you were pressured into against your better judgment." The letter continued in similar vein for another paragraph, each sentence a calculated wound. Sebastian felt rage build in his chest, cold and precise. "Mrs. Pemberton sent this," Violetta said quietly, her voice unnaturally controlled. She thought I should know what was being said before the rumors spread further. Cordelia has been attending every social gathering, positioning herself as the wounded party, the poor stepmother whose ungrateful daughter deceived a noble duke through calculated scheming. It's absurd. Sebastian set the letter aside with barely restrained violence. No one who knows anything about our marriage would believe such nonsense. But they don't know anything about our marriage, do they? Violetta's laugh was hollow. We've been at Blackwood for 3 months. We haven't attended any London events, haven't been seen together in society. For all anyone knows, Cordelia's version could be true. The overlooked wallflower who manipulated a marriage proposal through some desperate scheme, only to be set aside once the Duke came to his senses. Sebastian crouched before her chair, taking her cold hands in his. Violetta, look at me. This is malicious fiction designed to hurt you. Nothing more. Is it, though? Her eyes met his, and he saw fear there that cut deeper than any rumor. Sebastian, we both know how this marriage began. A practical arrangement, no affection involved. What's to stop people from believing that I manipulated that arrangement? That I've been... Stop! His voice was sharp enough to silence her. You've never manipulated anything. I proposed to you, clearly and directly. You accepted honestly, after careful consideration. What's happened since? He paused, struggling for words to encompass the transformation of the past months. What's grown between us has nothing to do with deception and everything to do with genuine connection. I know that. You know that. But how do we prove it to London society? Violetta pulled her hands free, standing and moving to the window with agitated energy. Cordelia is clever. She's positioning this in a way that makes denial look like confirmation. If you ignore the rumors, it suggests they're true. If you publicly defend the marriage, it looks like you're protecting yourself from embarrassment. Sebastian was about to respond when Mrs. Hendricks appeared in the doorway, her expression grim. Your Grace, Lady Cordelia Thorne is here. She's demanding to see both you and Her Grace immediately. I've put her in the small receiving room, but she's quite insistent. The silence that followed was dense with implication. Violetta's face had gone from pale to flushed, twin spots of color high on her cheeks. She's come here? To Blackwood? Apparently so. Sebastian felt his hands curl into fists before he consciously relaxed them. She's made a serious miscalculation if she thinks she can come to my home and spread poison. Sebastian, please. Violetta's voice carried a note of panic. Don't underestimate her. Cordelia is dangerous when she feels threatened, and you're choosing me over. Georgiana, she sees it as a personal humiliation that needs to be avenged. Then she's about to learn that humiliation has consequences. He offered Violetta his arm, feeling her trembling even as she tried to maintain composure. We'll face her together. She has no power here. Lady Cordelia Thorne waited in the receiving room like a beautiful serpent coiled to strike. She'd dressed for battle in deep emerald silk that complemented her still remarkable beauty, her posture radiating injured dignity and righteous anger in equal measure. When they entered, she rose with theatrical grace. Your Grace, she said, her curtsy to Sebastian perfect, while she barely acknowledged Violetta's presence. How kind of you to see me. I've come on a matter of grave family concern. Have you? Sebastian's tone could have frozen water. I assume this grave concern relates to the rumors you've been spreading in London about my marriage. Cordelia's eyes widened with practiced innocence. Spreading rumors? Your Grace, I've merely been honest about my concerns when questioned by friends. Surely you can't expect me to lie when people ask about dear Violetta's sudden elevation. What I expect Sebastian said with dangerous quiet, is for you to show proper respect for the Duchess of Blackwood. What I will not tolerate is malicious gossip designed to damage her reputation. Malicious? Cordelia laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Your Grace, I'm trying to protect everyone involved from scandal. The circumstances of this marriage were highly irregular. A single dance, a hasty proposal, a wedding within days. People naturally wonder whether there were compelling reasons for such haste. The compelling reasons were my choice and my business. Sebastian moved to stand beside Violetta, his hand finding hers in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity. I proposed to your stepdaughter because I recognized in her the qualities I value most: intelligence, integrity, genuine character. Qualities apparently absent in her family. The barb hit its mark. Cordelia's composure cracked, rage flashing across her features before she controlled it. You were deceived, she hissed, abandoning the pretense of concern. She's always been cunning, playing the victim while manipulating those around her. She spent my money, lived in my home, and repaid my generosity by stealing the match I'd cultivated for my own daughter. Your money? Violetta's voice cut through Cordelia's diatribe, quiet but edged with steel. The money you spent was my inheritance. The home you lived in was my mother's home. And the match you cultivated for Georgiana never existed, except in your ambitious imagination. Cordelia whirled on her, and Sebastian saw the naked hatred in her expression. You ungrateful little parasite. I gave you a home when your father could barely stand to look at you, dressed you, fed you. You spent every penny of my dowry on your daughter's wardrobe and your own. Social climbing, Violetta interrupted, and Sebastian felt pride surge through him at her steady voice, the way she refused to cower. You systematically destroyed my confidence, dismissed my worth, and ensured I understood I was tolerated only out of obligation. And now that I've escaped your household, you're so consumed with jealousy that you're willing to destroy my reputation out of spite. Jealous? Cordelia's laugh was shrill. Of you? Look at yourself, Violetta. You're still the same plain, awkward girl you always were. The Duke married you out of some misguided sense of charity or rebellion against society's expectations. Do you honestly believe he could love someone like you? The words were designed to wound, and Sebastian saw them land, saw Violetta flinch despite her attempts at composure. Rage, white-hot and absolute, consumed him. Get out. His voice was soft, deadly. Get out of my house, off my lands, and out of my wife's life. Now. Cordelia turned to him with calculated tears beginning to form. Your Grace, surely you can see I'm only trying to help. When this infatuation fades, when you realize what you've done. What I've done, Sebastian interrupted, his control fracturing into sharp-edged fury, is married the most remarkable woman I've ever met. What you've done is demonstrate exactly the kind of calculating, cruel opportunism that makes me grateful my wife escaped your household before you destroyed her completely. He moved closer to Cordelia, using his height and position to intimidate in a way he'd never done before. Let me be absolutely clear, since you seem determined to misunderstand. I chose Violetta deliberately. I married her willingly. And what's developed between us since has only confirmed that it was the best decision I've ever made. She is not merely my Duchess. She is my wife in every sense, my companion, my intellectual equal, and yes, the woman I love. The declaration hung in the air, and Sebastian felt Violetta's sharp intake of breath beside him, even as he kept his gaze fixed on Cordelia's shocked face. Now, he continued with icy precision, you will leave Blackwood immediately. You will return to London and correct every malicious rumor you've spread, making it clear that our marriage is genuine and happy. And you will never contact my wife again, directly or indirectly. If I hear of a single additional rumor, a single whispered innuendo, I will use every resource at my disposal to destroy your social standing so thoroughly that no door in London will open to you. Do you understand me? Cordelia's beautiful face had gone ugly with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this," she spat. "Both of you. When society sees through this pathetic charade, the only charade here is your performance as a concerned stepmother." Sebastian moved to the door, opening it to reveal 2 footmen waiting just outside. "Escort Lady Cordelia to her carriage, immediately." Cordelia gathered her skirts. With shaking hands, her composure shattered beyond repair. At the door, she turned back one last time. "You've made a powerful enemy, Your Grace." "No," Sebastian said quietly. "You've made one. The difference being that I have the power to back up my threats, and you have nothing but malicious gossip and thwarted ambition. Now get out before I have you physically removed." The footman escorted her out, and silence fell over the receiving room like snow. Sebastian turned to find Violetta trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, tears she'd refused to shed in Cordelia's presence now streaming down her face. "Did you mean it?" she whispered. "What you said about loving me?" Sebastian closed the distance between them, pulling her into his arms. "Every word. I should have said it weeks ago. Should have told you properly, rather than declaring it in anger to your vicious stepmother. But yes, Violetta, I love you. Not for your usefulness or your competence or any practical reason. I love you for who you are." She buried her face against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "She's right, though. I'm still just—" "You're everything," Sebastian interrupted fiercely. "And I'm going to spend however long it takes convincing you of that, starting with returning to London and showing all of society exactly how much the Duke of Blackwood values his Duchess." The confrontation with Cordelia had ended with her departure. But she hadn't left Blackwood Manor. Sebastian discovered this unsettling fact when Mrs. Hendricks appeared in his study an hour later, her expression troubled in a way he'd rarely seen. "Your Grace, I apologize for disturbing you." But Lady Cordelia refused to leave the grounds. Her driver says she dismissed him and sent the carriage away. She's in the morning room and has demanded, a final private audience with Her Grace. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Absolutely not. Have 2 footmen escort her to the village. She can arrange her own transportation from there. I tried, Your Grace. She's threatening to create a scene if forced to leave. She says she has information about Her Grace's mother that Violetta would want to hear. Mrs. Hendricks hesitated. I wouldn't have bothered you with this manipulation. But Her Grace heard the commotion and has already gone to the morning room. Sebastian was moving before Mrs. Hendricks finished speaking, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He could hear raised voices as he approached the morning room. Cordelia's sharp and cruel. Violetta's quieter, but strained. He pushed open the door without knocking. The scene was worse than he'd imagined. Violetta stood by the window, her face pale and set, while Cordelia circled her like a predator who'd cornered wounded prey. The older woman's beautiful features were twisted with such venom that Sebastian barely recognized the practiced charm she usually wore. Pathetic delusion, if you think he'll continue this charade once he's had time to think clearly, Cordelia was saying. Look at yourself, Violetta. Really look. You're plain at best, with none of the grace or beauty required for your position. You have no conversation that would interest a man of the Duke's sophistication, No accomplishments beyond your tedious books. That's enough. Sebastian's voice cut through the room like a blade, but Cordelia didn't even pause. Your mother would be ashamed, she continued, her words designed for maximum damage. She had such hopes for you, convinced herself you had some hidden worth that would eventually shine through. But even she knew, deep down, that you were a disappointment. She told me once, near the end, that she worried no man would ever want you for yourself. I said that's enough. Sebastian crossed the room in 3 strides, positioning himself between Cordelia and Violetta. You will not speak to my wife that way. Not in her home, not anywhere. Cordelia's laugh was brittle. Her home? For how long, Your Grace? Until you tire of this little experiment in charity? Until you remember what you could have had, a proper duchess, someone like my Georgiana who was bred for this role? Someone beautiful enough to grace your arm without embarrassment? Accomplished enough to represent the Blackwood name with dignity? Someone shallow enough to be impressed by a title and mercenary enough to marry for position rather than genuine regard? Sebastian's voice was dangerously soft. No, thank you. I've had quite enough of that particular variety of woman. You're making a mockery of your position, Cordelia hissed, abandoning all pretense of civility. The Duke of Blackwood? One of the most powerful men in England, shackling himself to a nobody out of some misguided rebellion against society. It's pathetic. She's pathetic. And everyone in London knows it. Sebastian felt rage building in his chest, the careful control he'd maintained his entire life fraying at the edges. You want to know what's pathetic? A woman so consumed by social ambition that she spent her stepdaughter's inheritance, destroyed her confidence, and is now attempting to ruin her marriage out of pure spite. That's pathetic, Lady Cordelia. You are pathetic. Cordelia's face flushed crimson. How dare you? How dare I? Sebastian laughed without humor. How dare you come to my home, insult my wife, and expect to be tolerated because of some misplaced notion of family connection? Let me be very clear about something, since you seem determined to misunderstand. Violetta is not your family. She hasn't been since the moment she accepted my proposal. She is a Crane now, the Duchess of Blackwood, and she is under my protection. Absolute protection. He moved closer to Cordelia, using every inch of his height and the full weight of his title to intimidate. You think she's plain? I find her beautiful, not in the obvious, calculated way you value, but in ways that matter. Her intelligence when she's absorbed in solving a problem. The compassion she shows to everyone from the lowest scullery maid to the highest-ranking tenant. The courage it takes to be kind after years of your cruelty. That's real beauty. And it makes your artificial charm look exactly like the shallow performance it is. Cordelia opened her mouth to respond, but Sebastian wasn't finished. You think she's unaccomplished? She's reorganized a library that defeated 3 generations of Blackwood dukes. She's improved the efficiency of the household, earned the genuine respect of the staff, and can discuss philosophy and literature with more depth than most Cambridge graduates. But more than that. His voice softened as he glanced back at Violetta, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. She's taught me what it means to be seen as a person rather than a title. She's made this house feel like a home for the first time since my mother died. And she's made me happier than I knew I could be. Pretty speech, Cordelia sneered, though her voice shook. But we both know nothing. Sebastian's patience shattered completely. You know nothing about my marriage, nothing about my wife, and nothing about what I value or why. You came here thinking you could manipulate the situation, plant enough doubt to destroy what Violetta and I have built, but you've failed completely because you're operating from a fundamental misunderstanding. He reached back, finding Violetta's hand and pulling her forward to stand beside him. You think this marriage is about duty or charity or some practical arrangement that could be undermined by rumors and cruel words. But that's not what this is. Not anymore. I love her, Lady Cordelia. Deeply, genuinely, in ways your mercenary soul probably can't comprehend. And nothing you say or do will change that. Cordelia's composure cracked entirely, rage and humiliation warring across her features. You fool, she spat. You've thrown away everything. Your reputation, your standing, your chance at a proper alliance. For what? For her? She gestured at Violetta with contempt. She's nothing. She'll always be nothing, no matter what title you give her. The insult was too much. Sebastian felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Get out, he said quietly. Not just from this room, from Blackwood entirely, from Violetta's life. You are no longer welcome here, and if I ever hear that you've attempted to contact my wife again, I will destroy you. You can't. I'm the Duke of Blackwood, Sebastian interrupted, his voice carrying the full weight of 3 centuries of power and privilege. I can do exactly what I promise. I can ensure that no respectable household in England receives you. I can make your creditors aware that the Blackwood influence no longer protects you in any way. I can investigate exactly how you've been maintaining your lifestyle on what I suspect is entirely borrowed money and ensure those debts come due immediately. He watched comprehension and fear dawn in Cordelia's eyes. Your daughter might still make a respectable match if you leave quietly now. But if you push this further, if you continue to attack Violetta, I will make certain that the Thorn name becomes synonymous with social climbing and cruelty. Georgiana will suffer for your actions. Is that what you want? The mention of her daughter hit its mark. Cordelia's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her even as hatred still burned in her eyes. You'll regret this, she whispered. Both of you. The only regret I have, Sebastian said coldly, is that I didn't eject you from this house the moment you arrived. Now get out before I have you physically carried to the property line. He turned to the door, finding the 2 footmen he'd stationed outside waiting. Escort Lady Cordelia to the village. Ensure she boards the next coach to London. She is never to set foot on Blackwood lands again. Cordelia drew herself up with the tattered remains of her dignity. At the door, she turned back one final time. She'll never be good enough for you, she said to Sebastian, and you'll realize it eventually. She's far too good for me, Sebastian replied quietly. That's what you've never understood. Now go. The footmen escorted Cordelia out, and Sebastian heard her protests fade as they moved down the corridor. He turned to find Violetta standing frozen by the window, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. She came to talk about my mother, and I thought I shouldn't have let her stay. Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. She's a master manipulator who used your love for your mother against you. The things she said, Violetta's voice broke, about me being plain, being inadequate, were lies designed to hurt you. Sebastian tilted her face up to his, making sure she could see the truth in his eyes. Violetta, listen to me. You are beautiful. You are accomplished. You are everything I didn't know I needed and more than I deserve. And I will spend the rest of our lives proving that to you, if necessary. She searched his face, looking for doubt or deception. You really meant it? What you said about loving me. Every word. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tears on her lashes. I love you. Not despite who you are, but because of it. Your kindness, your intelligence, your quiet strength. They've transformed my entire life. You've made this cold house warm. You've made me feel things I thought I was incapable of feeling. I love you too, Violetta whispered. I've been afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think I was trying to change the terms of our arrangement. The terms changed the moment I started looking forward to seeing you more than anything else in my day, Sebastian said. Probably long before that, if I'm honest. I was just too stubborn and too frightened to admit it. They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the afternoon light faded. And Sebastian felt a bone-deep certainty that defending Violetta against Cordelia's venom had been the easiest decision he'd ever made. She was his wife, his duchess, his love, and he would protect her against anyone who tried to diminish her worth. We should go to London, he said finally. Show society exactly what Lady Cordelia tried so hard to discredit. Show them that this marriage is real and strong, and everything a partnership should be. Violetta pulled back to look at him, worry creasing her brow. Are you certain? Facing all those people, all that judgment, I'm certain, Sebastian said firmly, because they need to see what I see. A duchess who deserves every respect due to her position, and a woman who deserves to be loved exactly as she is. The Ashworth Ball was the most anticipated event of the little season. The kind of gathering where reputations were made and destroyed with equal efficiency. Sebastian chose it deliberately for exactly that reason. If they were going to make a public statement about their marriage, it needed to be on the largest possible stage. Violetta stood before the mirror in their London townhouse, trying to steady her breathing while her new lady's maid made final adjustments to her gown. The dress was unlike anything she'd ever worn, deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of her eyes, cut in the latest fashion with an elegance that stopped just short of daring. Sebastian had commissioned it specifically for tonight from London's most sought-after modiste, along with an entire wardrobe that had made Violetta protest the extravagance until he'd silenced her objections with a kiss. You look beautiful, Sebastian said from the doorway, and Violetta met his eyes in the mirror. He wore formal black evening clothes that emphasized his height and the austere elegance of his features. But it was his expression that made her breath catch, pride and desire in equal measure. I look terrified, Violetta corrected, turning to face him. Sebastian, what if this makes things worse? What if people see through us? Think we're performing? Then they're fools, he interrupted gently, crossing the room to take her hands. But they won't, because we're not performing. We're simply showing them the truth. He pulled a velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a necklace that made Violetta gasp. Sapphires and diamonds caught the lamplight, arranged in an intricate design that managed to be both historically significant and breathtakingly beautiful. This was my mother's, Sebastian said quietly. The Blackwood sapphires, traditionally worn by the Duchess. My father put them away after she died, and I haven't looked at them in 20 years. But I want you to wear them tonight, Violetta. I want everyone to see that you're not just my wife in name. You're my Duchess in every way that matters. Violetta's hands trembled as he fastened the necklace, the weight of it settling against her collarbone like a benediction. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The frightened girl who'd stood at the edge of the Devonshire ball 6 months ago had been replaced by someone who looked like she belonged in these jewels, in this life. I'm still frightened, she admitted. So am I, Sebastian confessed, surprising her. I've spent my entire adult life avoiding exactly this kind of public vulnerability, But you're worth the risk, Violetta. We're worth the risk. The Ashworth ballroom was already crowded when they arrived, and Violetta felt the moment their presence registered. Conversations stuttering to silence, heads turning, the ripple of awareness spreading through the room like a stone dropped in still water. She could practically hear the thoughts. There she is, the nobody who trapped the Duke of Blackwood. Let's see how long this lasts. Lady Cordelia stood near the refreshment tables, surrounded by a small court of sympathetic matrons, her expression carefully arranged in wounded dignity. When she saw Violetta and Sebastian, something vicious flashed across her features before she controlled it. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you in London," their hostess, Lady Ashworth, gushed, her eyes cataloging every detail of Violetta's appearance. "We've heard such interesting things about your marriage." "Have you?" Sebastian's tone was pleasant, but edged with warning. "I hope you've heard that I'm the luckiest man in England to have found such a remarkable wife." The declaration, delivered with absolute conviction in a voice that carried across half the ballroom, created another ripple of reaction. Violetta felt eyes boring into her from every direction, assessing, judging, trying to determine if Sebastian's words were genuine or elaborate social performance. They moved through the crowd, Sebastian keeping Violetta's hand firmly on his arm, and she felt the strength of his presence like armor against the whispered speculation. He introduced her to important political figures, society matrons, influential peers, and with each introduction, he made clear through word and gesture that Violetta was not merely tolerated, but valued. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice, and Violetta turned to find Mrs. Pemberton, her mother's old friend, smiling with genuine warmth. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "It does," Violetta said softly, meaning it. "More than I ever imagined." The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Sebastian turned to Violetta with a slight bow. "Would you do me the honor, Your Grace?" It was a deliberate echo of that first dance at Devonshire House, when he'd shocked London by choosing her over every eligible beauty in the room. But this time, when they took their positions on the floor, Violetta didn't feel like an imposter waiting to be exposed. She felt like she belonged here, in his arms, in this life they'd built together. They danced in comfortable silence for several measures before Sebastian spoke. "I have something I need to say to you. Something I should have said properly long before now. Sebastian, please, let me finish." He guided her through a turn, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "When I proposed to you 6 months ago, I convinced myself I was being practical. I needed a wife who wouldn't demand emotional investment. Someone intelligent enough to manage my household and composed enough to serve as a barrier against society's expectations. I told myself it was a business arrangement that would benefit us both." Violetta's throat tightened with emotion, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I was lying to myself," Sebastian said quietly. "Even then, I think I recognized something in you that I'd been searching for without knowing it. Your dignity in the face of your stepmother's cruelty. Your intelligence that had been systematically dismissed and undervalued. The quiet strength that had survived years of emotional abuse. I told myself I was rescuing you, being charitable, when the truth is you rescued me. I didn't. You did." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made the crowded ballroom disappear. "You rescued me from a life of isolation and emotional distance. From the cold existence my father taught me was appropriate for someone of my rank. You taught me that genuine connection isn't weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this worth having." The music swelled around them, but Violetta barely heard it over the pounding of her heart. "I love you, Violetta," Sebastian said, his voice carrying just enough that nearby couples could hear. Not because you're useful or convenient or any of the practical reasons I initially convinced myself mattered. I love you because you're brilliant and kind and brave. Because you make me laugh and challenge my thinking and see me as Sebastian, rather than just the Duke of Blackwood. Because coming home to you is the best part of every day. Tears blurred Violetta's vision. Sebastian, everyone's listening. Good. He smiled, and the expression transformed his usually severe features into something radiant. I want them to hear this. I want all of London to know exactly how much I value my Duchess. As the waltz ended, Sebastian didn't release her. Instead, he signaled the orchestra to pause, and the sudden silence was deafening. Violetta felt panic spike. What was he doing? But his hand tightened reassuringly on hers. Your Graces, lords and ladies, Sebastian's voice carried across the ballroom with the natural authority of someone born to command attention. I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. I have something I wish to say publicly. The crowd pressed closer, avid curiosity overcoming social restraint. Violetta saw Lady Cordelia's face go pale, saw the mixture of anticipation and judgment on hundreds of faces. 6 months ago, I married Violetta Montgomery, Sebastian continued. There have been rumors about the nature of that marriage, speculation about my motives, suggestions that it was a temporary arrangement or a decision made in haste that I've come to regret. The silence was absolute. Violetta could hear her own heartbeat, feel the weight of every eye in the room. I want to address those rumors directly, Sebastian said, his gaze sweeping the crowd before returning to Violetta. My only regret about marrying Violetta is that I didn't do it sooner. That I wasted years of my life maintaining the emotional distance I'd been taught was appropriate, when I could have been searching for someone like her. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was intimate enough to make several matrons gasp. My wife is the most remarkable woman I've ever met. She's brilliant. She's currently cataloging the Blackwood Library, a task that defeated 3 generations before her. She's compassionate. Our staff and tenants adore her because she treats everyone with genuine respect and kindness. And she's brave in ways I'm only beginning to understand, having survived years of treatment that would have broken someone with less strength. Violetta saw tears on Mrs. Pemberton's face, saw shocked recognition on others who were reassessing every rumor they'd heard. When Lady Cordelia suggested that Violetta wasn't my type, Sebastian continued, his voice hardening slightly, she was absolutely right. Violetta isn't my type. She's infinitely better than any type I thought I wanted. She's real where others are performance. She's substantive where others are shallow. She's everything I didn't know I needed until she transformed my life completely. He turned to face Violetta fully, speaking to her now rather than the crowd, though his voice still carried. You asked me once what we were becoming. I didn't have words for it then, but I do now. We're becoming partners in the truest sense, equals who make each other better. And I want everyone here to know that I consider myself the luckiest man in England to have earned your love. The ballroom erupted in whispers, but Sebastian wasn't finished. He pulled another velvet box from his pocket. When had he acquired a second one, and opened it to reveal a ring? Not a practical signet or a decorative bauble, but a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that matched the necklace she wore. I never gave you a proper betrothal ring, Sebastian said quietly, though the crowd strained to hear. I told myself our arrangement didn't require such sentimentality. But Violetta, you deserve every romantic gesture I'm capable of making. You deserve to be courted and celebrated and loved exactly as you are. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Violetta couldn't stop the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "I love you," Sebastian said, for the third time that evening, and Violetta realized he was systematically dismantling every doubt Cordelia had planted, every whisper that their marriage was anything less than genuine. "You're not just my type. You're the only woman I've ever truly desired. The only one I'll ever want." Violetta launched herself into his arms, propriety forgotten, and kissed him in front of all of London society. The crowd gasped, then began to applaud. And when they finally broke apart, Violetta saw Lady Cordelia slipping toward the exit, her court of sympathetic matrons notably absent. "Was that sufficiently public?" Sebastian murmured against her hair. "Devastatingly so," Violetta laughed through her tears. "I think you've just scandalized half of London." "Good. Let them be scandalized by genuine affection for once instead of malicious gossip." He pulled back to look at her, his severe features softened by the same love she felt overwhelming her own chest. "Are you all right?" "I know that was rather dramatic." "It was perfect," Violetta interrupted. "You were perfect. I love you so much." They danced 3 more waltzes, Sebastian claiming her hand for each one in defiance of propriety, and Violetta felt the whispers around them shift. Not scandal now, but romance. The austere Duke of Blackwood, transformed by love into someone capable of public declarations and dramatic gestures. As they finally left the ballroom in the early hours of morning, Violetta caught a glimpse of herself in one of the tall mirrors. The frightened girl who'd believed herself unworthy of notice was gone completely, replaced by a woman who knew herself loved and valued. The Duchess of Blackwood, not through manipulation or deception, but through genuine connection that had transformed them both. "Take me home," she said to Sebastian, and the word home encompassed not just Blackwood Manor, but the life they'd built together, the partnership that had grown from practical arrangement into profound love. "Always," Sebastian promised, and Violetta knew he meant it. Not just tonight, but forever. My lovely family, if Violetta's transformation from overlooked daughter to beloved duchess moved you, if Sebastian's public declaration gave you hope, if this story reminded you that genuine love is worth fighting for, then I'm begging you, don't let this be the end of our connection. Subscribe so you never miss another story like this. Like this video so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs to believe they're someone's only type. You've just spent hours with Violetta and Sebastian. Give me 3 more seconds to subscribe, because unlike Cordelia, I'm not too proud to ask for what I need. Your support. Click that button now, and I'll see you in the next story. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.